Welcome back to the Towards Data Science podcast, and for today's episode, we'll be talking to Divya Siddarth, who is an associate political economist and social technologist in the office of the CTO at Microsoft. Now, that's obviously a somewhat unusual job title for a guest on the Towards Data Science podcast, but that's what makes Divya so interesting. She works on understanding how technology can be used to benefit humanity with a specific focus on AI, and that's led her to investigate the ways that some governments are using technology and AI in particular to improve their decision making and build consensus among their citizens. And on top of all that, Divya has been advocating for a new way to think about AI that she hopes will encourage industry and governments to move away from the goal of building a single centralized superintelligence, which is what many companies like OpenAI seem to be pursuing. It was a great exploration that mixed together history, technology, governance, and AI into a fun conversational package that I've definitely prefaced enough here already. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'll step out of the way and let it start. So hi, Divya. Thanks so much for joining me for the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I'm really excited to have you. You have like a really cool job, which is, I mean, a lot of the people we talk to have really cool jobs, but you have a job that's cool because it's at the intersection of a whole bunch of different cool things, which we'll get to in a minute. But broadly, you're in the space of AI policy, understanding how we ought to think about AI and how we ought to think about technology more generally. So I thought you'd be just a great person to have on the podcast to explore sort of the more policy, kind of geopolitical side of this stuff, which is a story that I think the technical people who tend to listen to this podcast will be less familiar with. So as we kind of start to approach this, I think one of the best ways to go would be to begin with your past and how you came to this space. So what was your background and like what brought you to the world of like tech policy governance stuff?
Yeah, well, that's very kind of you. And I think I got here by sort of a question I find really central is pretty basic. You know, how do we collectively build towards a better future? And I think when you ask that question, there's a lot to unpack. Who is we? What's better? Better for whom? How do we know it's better? You know, those kinds of things just start coming up right away. And to answer that, I think you really have to keep in mind these questions of power and prefiguration. So, you know, who has decision-making power over the systems that govern us? And how do we keep in mind that the things we build along the way are in line with the world we'd eventually want to see? So it's about reflecting values in process that you can't divorce means and ends and these kinds of, you know, how I started answering that big question. And I've tried to really sort of focus, therefore, on seeing technology as situated within these broader socio-technical, political, and economic systems. And I've approached this from a ton of different perspectives. I don't think there's necessarily a right one. I started out at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford, taught classes on using tech for good around digital security for activism. I then moved to India. I did field work on interactions between social movements and political parties and tech. I worked with a bunch of institutions on mechanisms for better data governance and, you know, collective ownership over data, including working on crowdsourcing speech data for language models that were able to capture truly insane array of Indian languages, most of which don't have any data on them. So a lot of the technology that comes out of that, right, coming back into the socio-technical element, people can't use it because it's not trained on a corpus of data that is big enough. And so, you know, there have also been times where I feel like I'm approaching the social kind of element from the existing state of tech. Like I've done some research on governance in the blockchain space, specifically on, you know, how do we phase out these proof of work, proof of stake protocols with something like proof of personhood. So participation being not gated by the resources that you have, which is the case with proof of work and proof of stake, but more by, well, being a person, as in the name. So I think there are ways to kind of get to that socio-technical element through the tech, and then there are ways to get through it through the social element. So I spent almost a year working on COVID policy with the Harvard Safra Center, first on contact tracing and privacy, then on calculating and advocating for, you know, specific kinds of resource allocation in ways that really sort of took on the coordination problem the country was facing head on, right? The federation issue, institutions, states, all of that, capabilities and needs of different regions. And right now, in addition to thinking about the AI ecosystem, as you mentioned, I'm working with groups like the Radical Exchange Foundation and the Ostrom Workshop to kind of envision, well, what could a new version of kind of digital public infrastructure look like? What are the basic things in the technical ecosystem that everyone should have access to, and not just access to using, but like real access to building and real sort of decision-making power over? Is it open data? Is it open knowledge like Wikipedia? Is it distributed economic opportunity, open tools for democracy, all of which I'm sure we'll get into. And that's based on some of the successful examples we've seen like Taiwan. So I think, in terms of thinking about AI policy and my job, which is also being an associate political economist and social technologist at Microsoft, all my favorite words in that title, I'd say it's sort of AI has become very central to the things that I've always cared about, more than I kind of intentionally sought out AI policy. And so I feel like as AI and the whole sort of behemoth surrounding AI became crucial to these questions of power and prefiguration and these socio-technical systems and the actual economic and political effects that they're having, I've started finding it more interesting and important to examine that, to think about what it's doing. So it kind of feels like AI policy sort of came to me where I was at more than anything else.
Well, I'm glad you highlighted as well the kind of broader technology governance issues that you've explored, because when we've talked about this in the past and when I've seen examples of your work, it really has been the case that like you have this very broad lens. And I think this is something where, when we've talked to AI policy people on the podcast before, and like it's great because they're highly specialized, but it is the case that it's hard sometimes to tell where the AI begins and ends, and when you're actually having a conversation about like data and how it's stored or just technology more broadly, which I think brings us then quite neatly to the first thing I really wanted to dive into, because you've done a lot of thinking and writing actually about Taiwan and the way that they manage technology, that the way that they have their sort of governance infrastructure set up to enable kind of collaboration between a large population of people who have a lot of disagreements. The government of Taiwan's gone back and forth between different political parties and factions. I've come to see social media and like maybe technology more broadly, but at least social media as almost intrinsically divisive. And I don't think it has to be that way. But there's a sense in which I think most people follow that narrative to a certain extent. Do things have to be that way? And if they don't have to be that way, what do you think we need to change about our approach? Maybe what is it that Taiwan does really well to kind of correct for that?
Yeah, well, one, I think it's really important what you sort of started out with in terms of saying, when we're talking about AI, when we're talking about social media, well, how much of it is the social system? How much of it is the data? How much of it is kind of the infrastructure behind it? How much of it is the government, right? And kind of piecing those things apart. And I think with this question, well, it brings up how much agency should we give the technology in how we think about things versus the social systems versus individual choice and participation. And I think one frame I really like for balancing these things is kind of coming at it from the lens of affordances or affordance theory. So super quickly, affordance theory came out of the work of James Gibson, psychologist, I think in the 70s, established this idea that affordances were the attributes of an object that let it work. And then Don Norman brought this to HCI, sort of focused on how designers could design objects that communicate to users what they should be doing. So like a push sign on a door, right, communicates to you what you should be doing. And if it actually is a pull door, you'll be upset. It's communicated to you incorrectly. And you can sort of then suggest affordances and also restrict affordances based on what you do, either intentionally or unintentionally. So you could put push on a door and actually it could be push or pull, but if most people will push on it. And so you're kind of nudging behavior, even though the system may work either way.
And is this like the design of everyday things? I think
yes.
There's like a book. Okay, yeah.
Yes, highly recommend the design of everyday things. And I also actually really like Jenny Davis's update called How Artifacts Afford, that kind of takes Don Norman's and then kind of, I think, brings it into this more social sphere and also the more material economic consequences of stuff. And she says affordances are how the features of a tech enable or constrain human behavior, but also the social implications. So what does a technology do with the broader social system? And I think that brings us to social media. So for example, Instagram, she has this great example of it where it makes it very easy to share images, right? Like that's an affordance of Instagram. It's super simple to do it. But it then we see has some social implications where, well, maybe when you're at an event, you're much more likely to feel like you should share an image because it's so much easier for everyone and everyone's doing it. And so that affordance has a broader effect. And so I think that gives us this good balance between saying, like, yes, the tech matters, the design matters, the way Facebook is designed for virality matters, it makes a difference, it affects our behavior, but it avoids tech determinism. So it says tech doesn't make us do things, it affords us to be able to do things. certain actions and certain behaviors are more enabled or more constrained on these platforms, but we still, have agency in how we interact with them and how we set up their surrounding systems.
I think that's a really interesting question about almost like at the free will level, like how we interact with things. It seems to me like, especially in the space of tech, when you look at social media platforms, there is something like a tyranny of optimality, where you see people kind of lose themselves in their big Twitter accounts, their big YouTube accounts, like whatever it is. There's a way to optimally use these things to get maximum reach. And that way requires that you sacrifice authenticity in many cases, that you sacrifice yourself to, in a way, the algorithms. How does that fit into the affordance picture? Are these complementary? Are they contradictory? Like, how do you think about that?
I think this is exactly what affordances are trying to describe, right? Which is the way the YouTube system is set up, the way the recommendation algorithm is set up means that it affords certain kinds of videos to become popular. If you post at a very regular cycle, if you have videos under an hour, etc., the system is set up so that it enables behavior that, popularizes those videos. But you can find success on the platform not doing that. And so it's not the case that it determines our behavior so much as by allowing certain things to work better than others, by basically putting push on the door, we're all going to push, and it allows that. It makes it easier. It's much easier to push that door than pull it. And so it's, there is still the option. There are people who do lots of other types of things on YouTube. I think on Facebook, for example, there's typical examples of like, oh, Facebook has helped democracy in X way, or people connect with their neighborhoods, versus, it does afford those things, but it's much easier to go down the route of polarization or misinformation, et cetera. So I think that to me kind of shows it's important to address the design. It's important to change the way those technologies are structured, but it's also important to say, well, can we build surrounding social systems that fight back against that enable different things to happen on platforms that do, in the end, have some degrees of freedom. It calls to mind, well, these platforms aren't neutral, which I think is becoming much clearer to both the public and obviously to legislators and everyone, that, there is, and even to companies themselves, like, oh, we found ourselves in a position where really like intermediating democracy, we're really intermediating businesses, like, how did this happen, right? And it's really a question of those things that you choose to afford versus not. And those are intentional design choices, but they may have unintentional consequences. They may have intentional consequences. Often it's a combination of both, right? But I think we can take the fact that we now know this, that we can analyze these things this way and say, well, what can we bring up as front and center that are different? What can we build them to do that are different? And so one of the clearest examples, as you mentioned, I'd say, is the way that consensus building platforms are used in Taiwan for collective governance. And I think it sort of flips many of the types of design choices we see made in social media platforms. So they're built on this technology called Polis, and the processes are called Be Taiwan and Join. And if we look at these from the lens of affordances, we say, well, look, these platforms are super simple. There are basically only 3 things you can do on them. You can submit a statement, you can look at a statement submitted by someone else, and you can agree or disagree with it. And then they're kind of, split into topics. So this whole thing will happen under one topic. There's no reply button, which means there's no real place to kind of engage in hate speech, trolling, misinformation, etc. It's really focused on productive action. And then the platform takes the responses people have, basically runs k-means clustering, visualizes clusters of agreement and disagreement. That's very simple, right? And this already sounds good, maybe, but it's not solving our democratic problems. And here's where the socio-technical design comes in. So this is only the first step of the process. So after this, people from different clusters who are involved in the process come together in facilitated groups, either online or offline, sometimes asynchronously, sometimes synchronously, and come up with new consensus statements across the clusters. So then there's a new set of statements that people can look at and agree with and disagree with.
Can I just ask about like how that would work in practice? Let's say like, we live in the same city with another 1 million people or so, and there's something is up for debate, like should we separate our recycling into like 3 different bins or something? And then there are a bunch of clusters, I guess, form from the answers that people give. So within those clusters, there's further debate. Is that kind of that next step?
Yeah, so an example that actually happened, we'll take Uber regulation. Okay, so this is one of the kind of major first tech regulation questions that came up on the platform. And initially there was basically two clusters ended up forming, a vaguely pro-Uber camp and a vaguely anti-Uber camp. Okay, so one camp being very much like this will be good for us, it's efficient, etc. The other one being like safety, concerns about existing drivers. And you can imagine this is where the process may stop somewhere else, right? You could be like, yeah, some people like it, some people don't like it. I guess the government is going to make a choice now. But instead, there was facilitated discussion, bringing people, not everyone, right? People who felt like they cared a lot and were representatives from each of these camps together with Uber, the company, representatives from the actual company showed up, with legislators who also showed up, and discussed what their concerns were. And coming out of that process, there were a second set of consensus statements. So these got a little bit more specific. They covered questions of, well, how do we want drivers to be registered? Like, what do we want to require for registration of drivers? What do we need for insurance and rider safety? And these set of consensus statements were put back into the tool to the broader group. And then there was almost universal approval of many of them, not all of them. And then this went to the legislature and got adopted into the regulation. And I think one of the great things is it's not that it came down on the side of pro or anti-Uber, right? It's not that there were headlines that were like pro-Uber camp wins, like success. It was very much a case of saying, well, what are the actual concerns under those clusters and can we address them? And did everyone leave the process happy? Naturally, no. But the idea that you could take that disagreement that you first see and then try to combine it, use these technical tools, but also the offline facilitation to get to consensus statement, I think really flips on its head what technology can do in this space. And one question is, well, this sounds like it takes some work, right? And I think it does take some work, but if we think about it, there are so many ways that people currently are involved in politics just by discussing it online. I mean, imagine how much time people spend. Yeah. And if it were possible to have more productive avenues, surveys just show, and actually when like regulatory rules are opened up for comment, for example, we see that people show up. They're really interested in wanting to do this. And one of the things that happens is that people will show up once, realize that, they submitted comments, they showed up to meetings and didn't feel like it was taken into account, and then they stop showing up. And so it's really the case, I think, that this feedback loop and closing it and institutionalizing it, right, and saying we're using this technology and we're sending this stuff directly to the legislature makes a really big difference, as well as the design of the tech itself.
There's one little technical detail there that you mentioned, which is this is done by k-means clustering, which of course is like the simplest clustering algorithm that you can pick. And I'm sure that's no coincidence. It's more transparent. I mean, people can just kind of see, like, it's easier to explain how the analysis is done. But it's still k-means clustering. And I imagine that that's something that would be difficult to convey, especially to some populations. Think of older folk who aren't necessarily plugged into like data and what it is and math and linear algebra. I mean, this is a significant kind of set of requirements. Is there something specific that Taiwan does to educate people about these tools, to kind of make them more familiar with the visualizations or what have you?
Yeah, so there's definitely a broader digital, so Audrey Tang is the digital minister of Taiwan, has sort of overseen a lot of these interventions, is amazing. And there's what she calls digital competence education that is now kind of a piece of K through 12 education, but also, older adults can go to digital competence education workshops and things like that I think do create more of an atmosphere of this working. So that's crucial. But there's also material guarantees, like there's universal broadband, and I think those kinds of basics are equally important where, I mean, how can we have these systems where a lot of Americans, for example, don't have access to broadband as we figured out during COVID? Well, we knew before, but it became very clear. Yeah. And so I think it's a combination of both of those things. And the third piece is, well, these are designed to have some ability of offline input. And I think there's a reason that that's there too, where there are, for the larger kind of things like this, offline facilitation sessions or ways to, talk to your council member offline, so that it doesn't cut out people who don't necessarily want to participate. The other thing I'll say is, so I've spent a lot of time on Polis, and the way it's set up, as you mentioned, k-means clustering is quite simple. And one of the things that makes it great is very easy to visualize. And so when you put in all your statements, you get a little dot, and that you see where that dot is in a cluster. And if you go back and you want to change some of your statements, your dot moves towards whatever, so it's just very kind of intuitive, I think, to see, well, oh, I'm with these guys now. And like, oh, now I'm with those people. Like, so I think there's an understanding of what people would want to understand about where their opinions are going.
Well, I'm loath to give the political compass people another excuse to throw out a bunch more memes, but that sounds pretty good. So that is interesting, and the fact that there's like an offline version for people who aren't necessarily tech savvy or math savvy sounds like a really good idea. It also makes me think that, like, I mean, in a way, this has us redefine what democracy means, because the democratic process, or the Republican process more generally, that you see in most democracies is pretty straightforward these days. Like, you have a bunch of people who sit up at podiums, they profess a bunch of policy ideas, and then eventually we all just like write a name on a ballot, or we put an X next to a name, and that's it. And now this sort of like cracks that black box open, and the democratic process becomes this more hands-on thing, it seems. And that seems to mean as well that, like, involvement in that hands-on process becomes integral to participation in democracy itself, which in turn makes me think people who are less tech savvy might actually be more excluded from that middle piece now, where policies are actually developed. This obviously isn't a reason not to do it. I think it's too easy to come up with like one little thing. All systems have problems, but is that something that you see as a challenge in this system?
Is your question more around like people who aren't experts in these domains maybe cut out because they don't know how to develop policy, or is it people who can't access these tech platforms, like don't know how to input their opinions into polis? Those
Yeah.
are the
Yeah, I'm thinking, yeah, something more along the lines of the second, where, let's say I have a grandmother who's totally like freaked out about iPads or what have you, and just won't use them, doesn't know how to turn them on, is intimidated. I imagine this has like a selective effect, where people like that will be selected out of that middle process, the kind of ideation process. And while they might have a say at the end of the day using more conventional kind of polling techniques, their opinion kind of doesn't get factored into the shaping part.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right now, for example, half the country's population is on both of these, a combination of these platforms. So that's half, which is great. It's also not the other half, right? And so I think that's why these offline pieces become particularly important. And the other kinds of, like, many members of the Taiwanese cabinet, for example, just answer questions that citizens put to them weekly or something like that. So I think those kinds of other processes, it's not just this one piece. It has to be an ecosystem approach to democracy. And I think that really gets us to, well, what do we mean about participation in democracy? What do those words mean, right? And as you pointed out, in many countries, it has become, well, I vote in elections, and that's what makes my country a democracy. And really, democratizing a system means having voice over the important parts of it, not just voting once every 4 years or 1 year. And I think that's where Taiwan really excels, where it's not just that they're bringing technology into governance, but there are other ways: access to building tech, decision-making power over the tech ecosystem, sharing in the benefits of that tech ecosystem, right? Building out open data coalitions that communities can participate in and gain benefit from, having volunteer networks of fact checkers for misinformation, like all of these kinds of systems that just bring people into technology, and then also make sure that the tech we're building is solving real problems. And I think we see, for example, with Taiwan's COVID response, that this system works. And that's something that I think we've almost forgotten in some, at least in the US, where we have democracy because it's important for people to have, input over their lives, but we also have democracy because it works. Like, it's a good way to aggregate information and fulfill a lot of people's preferences. It's a good way to have checks and balances in a well-designed system. Like, we have democratic processes because we want to do things that are good for people, and it's just a good, efficient way to do that. And I think we've really forgotten that that's one of the reasons we have democracy, right? And I think Taiwan really shows us, when we have broad access to things, amazing things get built, problems get solved, people get to, have a lot of agency over their concerns, but that leads to them solving those concerns many times. And so, I think that's one of the things that really sets Taiwan apart.
And why Taiwan? Why is this happening in Taiwan? Why isn't it happening like in the US or in Canada or anywhere else?
Well, I think one thing is, this isn't just happening in Taiwan. So tools for democratization of tech are being built everywhere. There's tools like Policy Kit and Community Rule and Radical Exchange Voice. There's a ton of stuff happening in the decentralized tech space. Super exciting, experiments in democratization. Polis isn't even the only tool of its kind. Lumio is an open source decision-making system built by a cooperative in New Zealand, being used across organizations to flatten decision-making processes. But I think one thing that sets Taiwan apart is that ecosystem structure, the institutional support, the depth of sort of partnership between different parts of this system. And that's actually a really interesting origin story, which is basically that a lot of this came out of the sunflower movement in Taiwan in 2014. And the sunflower movement itself came out of Occupy. So it was sort of an analog to Occupy Wall Street. And many of the tools that are used for deliberation, including Polis, were built to create consensus for convergence on what to do there, to transmit to the public. And Audrey likes to say, this changed our demonstration, kind of used as demonstration in terms of a protest, to a demonstration like a demo of what this technology can do, right? And actually, after the occupation ended, the Conservative Nationalist Party, which was in power, the party being protested against, were like, these tools are great. This is how we can rebuild trust in our government, which was really low at the time, very familiar to those of us in the US. Yeah. Especially after an occupied legislature. And they really welcomed Audrey in as Taiwan's first digital minister, started institutionalizing these tools. And then when the Democratic Progressive Party came into power after, they continued this. So it really was a sort of bipartisan understanding of, well, we need these tools in government. We need to become more technically savvy. We need to show the people, become more transparent, So I think that origin story shows us, well, one, there is something very specific that happened, but two, it's recent. And these innovations came out of a deeply divided country. And so I think that gives me a lot of hope to say, well, it's not some magical thing. It's really like ecosystem approach. Institutions decided they needed this. The public, started building alternatives and advocating for that. And that's what we could easily see in other places. I do think there are other countries that have very sort of tech-based democracy approaches. Estonia comes to mind. But to me, Taiwan stands out as being very participative in addition to having, a very technically focused government.
I'm just thinking of all the obstacles I would imagine encountering if this sort of thing were rolled out in Canada, which is the country I at least know best because that's where I live. But if you were try to do it here, I would imagine you'd run into every minister under the sun who is over 60 years of age get really intimidated by this, and then you're asking somebody like that to kind of to navigate these complexities. Obviously, it can be outsourced and handed down to advisors and things like that, but ultimately it has to come from the top in some meaningful sense. I guess the hope is that Taiwan will show an example of this working and the world will take note and then start to gradually go through this process of educating itself and developing technical competency at the top.
Partly, but I think, looking at how this happened in Taiwan, it also came from the grassroots movement. Part of it was civic hacking collectives, civic technologists, civil society groups that formed, this movement called GovZero that was a part of occupying the legislature. And they had allies in government, obviously. I think appointing a digital minister, for example, is a good start to doing some of these things. But I think we also see, well, governments aren't necessarily shying away from technology. If we're going to talk about AI later, governments are quite happy to say, well, we want national technology strategies. We don't want to fall behind, et cetera. So I think we are seeing a huge interest in tech broadly, even from people who clearly don't understand it, as you can tell if you watch congressional hearings. And so I think it's very possible to say, well, look, this type of system that is participative, that increases access to innovation, that brings technology into all these spheres, that brings in civil society, works and solves our problems. If you're really concerned about what the government is doing about technology, supporting a national tech ecosystem, et cetera, well, how about this approach? And I think that is an alternative that can really be held up.
I think the Taiwan example is a useful one to start with because it does lay out a couple of the principles that I think underlie your thinking when it comes to technology. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because I think that's something that you've done a lot of thinking about, is how you conceptualize AI and how the industry, in your view, today gets it wrong, or what some of the problems are with our current way of thinking about AI.
Yeah, I would sort of maybe paint the Taiwan example as an example of collective intelligence, right? Trying to augment the intelligence of systems, trying to create this sort of collective level of innovation, but also shared benefits on the economic side, participation on the political side, et cetera. And to me, on the flip side, there are sort of three things that define the current AI ecosystem: what we call actually existing AI, in a working paper I'm co-authoring with a bunch of incredible scholars across econ, tech, social sciences, political philosophy, and stuff. So you can see actually existing AI sort of comes from that capitalism versus actually existing capitalism distinction. And I would say there are three main pieces to this. And the first is human competition. So the target of sort of achieving general intelligence is often defined by comparison to, with the aim of surpassing some concept of generalized human level capabilities. And then I think there's autonomy. So targeting broadly the independence of these systems from human direction and agency. Working off, this requires a notion of intelligence as general and abstract and applicable to a lot of problems. So these two, I think, totally sidestep the fundamentally social nature of intelligence, what we think of as intelligence being contingent and co-created, not to mention that many systems that we see as autonomous are built on, a lot of data from people. So I think I would call them anyway collective intelligence systems, but they're not targeted towards that. They're really targeted towards this, human replicating, human surpassing, autonomous, powerful system kind of goal. And then the third piece is centralization. So basically centralizing massive resources and decision-making power at the hands of a small group. And I really see this as a feature of the first two, how the first two get accomplished. When you believe the general human level or beyond intelligence can be achieved autonomously, can be achieved by a system, the fact that this system is going to be super powerful, solve a ton of our problems. I mean, take the sort of DeepMind mission, solve intelligence, and use it to solve everything else. Well, the way to do that has to require centralization at a massive scale once you've set yourself up in that framing. So I think, you asked what I think this gets wrong. Well, one, we can see it is quite the flip side of the Taiwan approach, but also at a basic economic level, this is an aim to focus on the productive power of capital and not of labor, right? Capital is already owned in a super concentrated way. We're trying to make capital more productive. So this, of course, accrues, economic value to smaller and smaller groups. But beyond that, and maybe more perniciously, it hyper concentrates decision-making, choices about values, trade-offs within the tiny group of people that design the system, about everything. If we go back to that first question, how do we make the future better? Well, everything from what solving intelligence means, what intelligence is, what needs to be solved outside of intelligence, what solving that means, like all of that is decided by a tiny group of people because we've set up these human competitive autonomous systems. So I think this is really not the appropriate way to think about AI, but also not the most productive, not the most interesting, not the most innovative. So how do I think it should change? Well, I think it ties back to all the other stuff we've been talking about, this shift in focus to enabling human augmentation, building for collective intelligence instead of human replacing systems. And fundamentally, I think that comes from democratizing this process. AI is currently a space of central planning, basically, right? Yeah. Repeating the hubris that super centralized systems can be technocratically designed for the greater good, which has failed in history time and time again. Giant cities no one wants in Brasilia, mass starvations due to crop yield miscalculations, huge failures in the development tech space. And on the flip side, we see decentralized information processing and decision-making. We have those things to thank for a huge amount of our productivity increases and well-being increases. And the Taiwan example shows us that the potential of those kinds of processes in solving the current problems we're facing. And of course, this requires international cooperation and coordination. It requires leadership by powerful entities, right? It requires making it clear that this is in the interest of all the groups that we need to coordinate. But I'm convinced that it is in the interest of those groups. And in the long term, of course, but even in the medium to short term, I think it's clearly more productive and more useful. So I'd say a ton of rhetoric in this space is really around, building systems that are good for the future of humanity. And I think what's good for the future of humanity is humanity having a voice in its future. And so we should shift to that framing, and also in the way we actually build and deploy technology to reflect that.
So that's really interesting because there's a lot to unpack there. But one of the big through lines, at least to me, when I try to map that onto the actual tech, is that, and let me know if you disagree with this, but would your argument be that setting up a language model or a deep learning system or a reinforcement learning agent with a single loss function and then optimizing that loss function to blazes is a bad idea? This is a kind of a bad paradigm for machine learning. Do you think things like deep learning are kind of not intrinsically bad, but that they have built into them this preference, these affordances really that push us in that centralizing direction? Yeah,
I think it's really, I'm glad you brought up affordances. That's exactly what I was going to say. I think many of these kinds of systems do afford for centralized, hyper-optimized processes, which are quite brittle and very universalizing in a way that just isn't the best way to solve problems. However, as we talked about with affordance theory, I think it's a lot about what systems we embed that stuff in. So, I think the reason I wanted to distinguish between like AI, which is quite a fuzzy term that no one's super nailed down yet. Are we talking about the technologies? Are we talking about gradient descent? Are we talking about what startups call AI in their marketing materials, which is often just statistics? Like, what are we discussing? Right? And I think the reason I kind of started out with, well, here's what the target of this critique is because it's not all of those things that I'm critiquing and that we're trying to say, like, let's invest in alternatives to. It's really that brittle, centralizing, broadly social and technical system. And so I think, many of the concerns about risks from AI systems are most relevant to systems that are built to autonomously pursue ambitious goals with minimal constraints. Especially true when you take this alongside surpassing human capabilities. And if we're building these exact kinds of systems, we're saying we're building the systems that are directly going to be responsible for soaring long-term risk. This really becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's not the best way to solve our problems. So I think it makes much more sense to optimize for limited and constrained systems that are deeply integrated into social frameworks, and also to shore up areas, for example, of human comparative advantage. So I called into question the whole solve intelligence and use it to solve everything else thing earlier. But I think DeepMind's AlphaFold is an example of something that says, well, this plays to the machine advantage versus the human advantage. It's not intended to be human replacing. It's part of a broader human scientific system. I think those kinds of things make a lot of sense. They may not entirely break with the AI paradigm, and we can talk about approaches I'm excited about that do that. But I think that is something that is much more promising than many of the human replacing, sort of human surpassing autonomous rhetoric that we see.
And what would you say to a firm like, I'd imagine OpenAI would take the view that, well, just objectively, we've seen a ton of progress. Like we have, we've gone from GPT to GPT-2 to GPT-3 to DALL-E to CLIP. Like we've got all these systems that do display increasingly general sort of flexibility and capacity. And the goal of kind of replicating human behaviors, at least like through natural language, has gotten us very far. And it's one that's easy to follow. It's very tractable. Like you can clearly say, okay, the goal of this is to make an AI that's a really good conversational agent that will fool us into thinking it's human. So therefore, in a sense, to compete with humans directly. And that's just been like a really useful goal. It's been very helpful in guiding our progress. What would you see as like the main counter argument to that view?
The question is really, what are the systems and incentives you situate that within, right? Because there are ways to say, our aim is to support human collaboration, support human-machine collaboration. For this, the human and the machine need to understand each other. For this reason, there is a level of communication that we want to support the machine to be able to do with the human, humans to be able to do with each other. And I think a lot of that makes sense and is positive, and I would call that quite augmentative. And I think there's a whole set of work that leans into that approach. But I do think it's problematic, a couple of things that come out of the OpenAI frame, for example, where one, GPT-3 is trained on public data, Creative Commons licensed public data. And so it's really the case that it's being built out of existing human collective intelligence in a lot of ways to groups of people that don't even have access to GPT-3 mostly. And so what does that mean, right? And I think there are questions around that that say, well, there is something here that is somewhat antithetical to supporting collective intelligence if we're actually, extracting from collective intelligence and then not coming back and sort of providing that into the system. And then I think there are just approaches that chart new directions forward that take into account, like, yes, we want to move forward on these areas of technical growth, but we also want them to be embedded within these collective participative systems, like in Taiwan, where like maybe it's not the most advanced technology that's the most useful in every context. As you pointed out earlier, k-means clustering, super simple, and yet it's been used to such great effect. That's still a lot more advanced than many other things in that space. So I think it's really a question of saying, are we building the technology that is targeted towards solving the problems we have when each of those problems come up? And I think that will show us that, yes, sometimes we do want the advanced language tech, but often we want to be much more careful about what would be actually useful. I think one, there's real questions around whether AI development is actually efficiently, increasing productivity or creating economic growth. That's one of the core sort of tenets of our work. Current productivity growth is really stagnating, especially when compared to the golden age starting in the 50s. We're just not seeing an incredible rise in productive capacity. There's not really a clear case to be made that these technologies are broadly increasing productivity or creating economic growth. So I think there's a lot more actual economic promise in approaches that aim for human augmentation, cooperation, collaboration, take into account these different fields of study that we're talking about that have resulted in many of our most successful digital technologies already. The personal computer, right, the internet, really came out of many of these ways of thinking. And there's a great book on the history of computing called Machines of Love and Grace that I really recommend, in terms of kind of pointing out how the AI ideology almost has been followed in many ways by all of these different approaches, HCI, participative design, social tech, that, folks like Norman Wiener and Doug Engelbart created object-oriented programming and things like the personal computer and all of that stuff, coming out of, in many ways, critiques of the kind of universalizing AI approach. But anyway, that's a tangent. And so I think there is that piece that, I don't think it's correct to say that this is definitely the best way to create those economic outcomes. And then I'd also say there isn't, the reason we have institutions outside of the market, the state, civil society, the public, are that the economy doesn't really exist absent from those other concerns. So I think the most productive approach to markets is to see them as coordinating mechanisms, mechanisms for decentralized information processing, but as part of a range of other coordinating mechanisms, including democracy, as we talked about earlier. For example, corporations already engage with governments at every level of policy. There's already a huge amount of overlap in creating what the economy values. And the important thing to remember is that while there is sort of an economic gradient here, it's one that really involves interaction between different forms of human planning. And so we have agency over some of those different pieces, at least. For example, if you look at governments, which are not, first, the number one consumers of AI surveillance, so they're clearly incentivizing something there, but they also change incentives in the market significantly through regulation with things like the economist Darun Acemoglu, who's one of our co-authors and has great work on this topic, points out tax rates of around 25% on labor, but less than 5% on equipment and software. So they're basically subsidizing automation with things like that, right? And that is what sets up many of the economic incentives. So legislative will and democratic accountability could have huge effects here. Of course, there is a level of understanding, cooperation, and coordination at the international level that's required to look at these kinds of systems and say, here's how we're going to figure out whether these are broadly beneficial. Those methods of figuring it out will be democratic. But I think there's a huge risk to not doing that, as you pointed it out, but I think we don't say enough. There's a huge opportunity to doing a better job, to investing in decentralized, democratized approaches that take into account what people need from technology, that take into account the incredible innovation potential we already have in the 8 billion humans we have on this planet that we're not appropriately resourcing or supporting to be a part of any of these systems. And so while there is risk, and I think it's important to bring out the critique, to talk about the risk, I think there's a lot of opportunity to really zoom out and say, well, there's a ton of coordinating mechanisms here. Obviously, as someone who has said technocratic centralized systems don't work, I'm not saying like regulation is going to solve our problems here, right? Because then we're falling into the same trap. I think it's really about decentralizing and creating those coordinating mechanisms that are meaningfully decentralized, unlike many pieces of the market that we see now.
It sounds like there are two then layers to this argument. On the one hand, you say, I think there's a better way economically. In other words, I think there might actually be an opening, if I understand correctly, for startups that take a different approach from what OpenAI is taking, and that they, in the long run, will actually be more profitable. And then on the flip side, there's a kind of open question to governments about how they get involved in this in a more open way, maybe following something more akin to the Taiwan model. We're looking at the first one. So like for a new startup, if you were advising like a new startup to say, hey, you're going to go out and use this new paradigm, we're not going to get stuck in the kind of the actually existing AI paradigm that we're currently using. Here's a healthier paradigm. Here's how I want you to execute, or here's a category of problem that you should try to tackle that like maybe OpenAI wouldn't look at because of the way they're kind of philosophically inclined. What would that advice sound like?
I think it would really be to build technology to solve cooperation and coordination problems. I think many of the problems we face are broadly ones of, coordination and collaboration. And many of our most useful and productive technologies are ones that enable collaboration. For example, video conferencing was as far as you can imagine from AI in some ways, but has enabled a huge amount of productive increase, especially over the past year, right? And there's a great kind of anecdote in Don Norman's work that talks about, well, video conferencing, the idea is extremely old, but it took a lot of social changes for it to really unlock the level of productive capacity it suddenly has over the past year. And so I think really trying to be creative about those methods of collaboration is the way forward in terms of what technical approaches can do.
I guess I'm just thinking OpenAI's argument is probably like, it's like you said, I mean, it's like DeepMind. We solve first AI, and then that will give us all the video conferencing, the brain-to-brain interfaces, and all that stuff that we might need. Would you make the case that it's not in fact true that solving AI, getting to AGI or something like that would get us all these strange and wonderful things? Or is it just that if we get there in the way that OpenAI might be orienting towards right now, we will end up creating a real mess and not being able to reap the benefits?
I mentioned this concept of prefiguration at the beginning, the sort of unity of means and ends, the fact that you can't really separate how you get to something with how it ends up turning out, what the outcomes of it are going to be. And I think that's the kind of the concept I would bring to bear here to say, I don't think this aspiration in the current context is going to result in those kinds of things. I think this is a centralized aspiration, and these kinds of systems have historically been super susceptible to major failures that have had incredibly damaging effects. And every time the contention is sort of like, well, we're going to plan really well. We're going to take advantage of all the information we have, which is new, and really do the perfect job for people, right? And it's a top-down system. It's not about distribution of power. It's not about distribution often of economic opportunity beyond kind of post hoc distribution type clauses. And we see that failing time and time again. I think one interesting example is, well, central planning is something that came out of the Soviet system, and we all know how that failed. But a few technocrats, many from Harvard and just elite schools in the US, tried to redesign post-Soviet economies into what they thought was the perfect free market system by instituting this idealized market. But they made so many top-down design choices on regulation and structure, because you have to when you're instituting a system with zero input. And then, of course, over a few years, extreme inequality, oligarchies, collapse of these economies, right? So I think it's not the case that there's one centralized technocratic system that's failed and we just have to not repeat that. I think it's really, this is a cycle of people coming in and saying, well, we know how to do this type of thing better. And I just don't think that's ever succeeded.
Yeah, I mean, that I definitely agree with. And I definitely agree with the idea that the ultimate embodiment of this is like an AGI, a single thing running on a couple servers somewhere in like New Mexico, and we're going to empower this to do whatever. I guess one of the worries that I have in that respect is like, until the moment that goes horribly, horribly, horribly wrong. Right up to that moment, like all signals are go, everything looks wonderful, you're building a more and more powerful, incrementally more powerful and capable machine, and you're making more money from it, and there's no clear signal that, hey, like this is actually going to culminate in something awful, unless you're persuaded by arguments such as the one that you just made, which is that, you can't centralize and then think you'll be able to plan for whatever eventuality. Do you consider this to be an appeal to people to think in those terms, to say, hey, we have to transcend this temporary economic forcing function? Obviously, it's like you're going to be advantaged if you keep pushing, but like there's this whole gray area where we don't know where that tripwire is, and you're just going to keep pushing and pushing, and we're going to run right off the cliff. Are you calling attention to that, or is the argument actually you can make more money today by taking this different approach, this sort of decentralized approach?
I think it's certainly a bit of both, but the real throughput of the argument is alternatives are possible, right? It's really intended to be like, yes, first we set up the argument for why we need alternatives, and that comes from the kind of critique pieces we're talking about. But more importantly, there are a range of other investments you can make in super exciting, innovative technology that will be equally or more productive, that will, basically act as checks and balances on putting all your eggs in this basket, which I think a lot of kind of institutions are doing of various kinds, and be very promising and create that decentralized ecosystem for the technology we build to live in. That is more that creates more growth. And I think there's a lot that's borne out by that. And as you said earlier, maybe it would be different if all systems were go, if this was green lights all around, but I just don't think that's even the case now. I think we already see, we are getting more and more advanced AI systems. And is that solving our major problems that we are facing as a society? I think it's evident to say that it's not, right? I think we have faced major global crises, the pandemic. I think the Taiwan system clearly performed better than a centralized tech approach, which wasn't even really tried anywhere. You could argue that maybe China's approach is the closest to that, but Taiwan clearly outperformed China there. And there was a lot of brittleness of information transfer that came out of that system that you could say created many of the conditions for this. However, I think the US approach, did even worse than China in a lot of senses. And so that really shows us, well, what kinds of social and technical systems can we set up to succeed at solving global crises? Well, clearly not the ones we already have. And, similarly with things like climate change or other major threats, I don't think all systems are go. We talked about social media to start out this conversation. Well, that type of optimization tendency is becoming very clear that it has a lot of major issues. So I think it's not necessarily that this argument is that hard to make in some senses, even on the economic side, on the political side, to say this isn't the way that all of our problems are going to be solved. It's not currently solving our problems. There are other approaches that are more useful, and let's just invest in many of them. I think one of the major points is that, AI has seen incredibly disproportionate investment and, from major corporations, interest from governments, all of that in recent years. Let's diversify. And the term we use for that is called digital pluralism, where let's have a pluralist economy, right? Let's have a pluralist approach to technology, and really see which technologies are the most useful. And then I'm just confident that we'll find these other approaches to bear more fruit.
And if we kind of extrapolate out, and let's say the industry goes in this direction and focuses much more on decentralization, let's say also OpenAI decides to go in that direction too, do you imagine at some point we get to something like AGI in the way that most of us think of AGI, like one system that does it all? Or do we indefinitely kind of maintain some sort of decentralized system?
I think we will learn and find emergent intelligences in many different places where we haven't looked for or created them. I think, I see there's a lot of very poetic stuff written about how forests are intelligent systems and, mushroom colonies are intelligent systems. And, I think there's a lot that collective intelligence can create for us. And I think kind of more down to earth, well, markets are intelligent systems that bring collective intelligence to us. Democracies are intelligent systems. Bureaucracies, in many ways, are systems of collective intelligence. So I think we will find intelligences of many kinds that far surpass what we're currently capable of. And that's a much more exciting kind of model for me than a single general intelligence, which a few people define what that even means. I think we can progress so much farther and evolve so much more as humanity, as a broad ecology in this other way than we can by saying, well, we have one vision, it's based on us but better, and small groups of people are going to decide what it looks like, and then it's going to solve our problems. Well, I think it's so much more inspiring and something that I'd want to work towards and see this flowering of pluralist intelligences, all of which surpass our expectations. I think that's eminently possible and just a very beautiful and inspirational thought.
It sounds like you have a lot in common with Ben Goertzel, the way he thinks about these sorts of things. We had him on the podcast earlier. He's taking I think a little bit more of an unorthodox approach to this stuff technologically, but the spirit is very much, try to decentralize the development of this, hope that superintelligence emerges from interactions between individual systems that might be much more specialized, sort of like what you're recommending. This has me think of humanity very much as like already being a superintelligence. I mean, I don't think this is anything new. A lot of people have observed this, but in a way, correct me if I'm interpreting you wrong here, but you're almost talking about continuing down that path, saying, okay, this is already a superintelligence. We're just going to make it more superintelligent kind of in a more gradual way, rather than focusing the intelligence in one particular machine and having that take everything over. In that sense, it's a much more continuous version of human history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that historicism is often quite missing, or at least neglected in the space. That's sort of why I brought up the history of computing, for example, or histories of technology, or more broadly, histories of political and economic systems, where, these are not new aspirations. These are not new concerns. I think the base problems of making sure that people have agency over their lives, and also that the broader ecology is moving forward, that we're progressing as a society, that we're not painting our society with one broad brush. These questions of universalization, like these have consistently been present. I think that's why bringing other kind of schools of thinking into technology is so important, and also bringing what communities really need and have been saying for centuries into technology is crucial, so we can get to that point where we're historicizing ourselves accurately and using that wealth of knowledge to move forward. Why would we be deriving from first principles what humans have been thinking about since time immemorial, right? And I think there's a lot we forego, and a lot of knowledge we just cut ourselves off from if we do that.
Yeah, there's always this temptation to like simplify problems, like down to like one number, it's almost the definition of an ideology, it feels like, where you have like some number that aesthetically you're just really drawn to. Like you want, communism would be like, you want the standard deviation of incomes to be 0, and that just feels really good to you. And then like pure anarcho-capitalist libertarianism is like, you want maybe the mean and not the median income to be as high as possible, and I don't know, maybe some other stuff, but there's like some aesthetic sensibility, and then that leads to a commitment to like a specific kind of anchoring loss function. And maybe, if I'm interpreting you correctly, is sort of this idea of a much kind of dirtier, more organic process where no kind of individual loss function is prioritized, but you just kind of wait for the collective intelligence of human civilization to kind of come up with solutions organically.
I don't think you wait for it. I think that's, I think you can't wait for it, right? I think that's why we should collectively build and fund and resource systems that enable it, that create it, that allow for it. Because I think waiting for it is, the approach to saying a certain direction for technology development is bad cannot be don't develop technology. Right. One, I think that's not going to work for obvious reasons, economic incentives, political incentives, but also two, that's not what we're going for in the world, right? Like, I think progress is what we're going for. And also, we are not living in the best of all possible worlds. So why wouldn't we aim for something better, coming back to that first question, but let's be very intentional about who decides what better is, and how we get to it. And I think that really brings us back to, well, it's not about optimizing for a particular outcome. It's about building a really robust process, because we can't anticipate how the world is going to change. And the best kinds of outcomes come from very robust, flexible, dynamic, smart processes and designs that bring a lot of people in and that allow for that dynamism.
And looking at, you mentioned what role governments might play in this whole thing, as we move more towards something decentralized, sort of program that you're proposing here. What, if you could change one thing about the way governments are working with AI right now in order to accomplish that, what would that look like?
Well, I think a lot of it is on the democratization of these processes, really seeing with clear eyes what can be enabled with distributed type processes like we're seeing in Taiwan. But I think another piece is governments have huge ability to lead that investment in alternatives. In the US, for example, government was the central player in leading to the creation of the internet and a bunch of other really useful technologies. But I call out the internet because a lot of the original standard setting processes for internet governance were extremely polycentric, right? They brought in universities, they brought in different institutions, they brought in some civil society groups, they brought in private companies. And that's how we have things like TCP/IP, which the internet runs on. That's why HTTPS works, right? Like, so I think government has an incredible convening power and an incredible funding power. And, regulation is important. I think there are a lot of questions about monopolies right now. I think there are questions about data governance and privacy that, yes, there's some regulation that needs to be put in the space, but I really think that the biggest role government can play is not in regulating things away, but investing in useful alternatives, investing in people, investing in communities to create these things. And I would really love to see that.
The startup part of my brain thinks or feels like this is the important next step. This needs to be de-risked, I think, for companies. If people are going to put real investments in this direction, they've seen at least OpenAI's model, to some degree the DeepMind model, has been successful at generating some economic value, and like that's really enticing. And there's the promise of more economic value if they just keep pushing. Whereas we really need those counterexamples if people are going to go, okay, hold on, let's move in that direction, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's very hard you're not going to get a group of people excited by being like, oh, let's all not do that together. So I think we really do have to start investing in, and that is one of the major roles that government can play in one, understanding what people want, acting as that coordination mechanism, and then two, using that to invest in alternatives. I do think that there is a role for criticism to play here, because that is how we point out some of these flaws in a way that is kind of nuanced and specific enough to say, well, we're not saying this ecosystem is entirely bad because there's nothing that can be done about that. What is it exactly that is the problem? Is it the data pipeline that is the problem? Is it the way that corporate governance works that is the problem? Is it the regulation of this particular thing that is the problem? Is it that this community had to live under a certain surveillance system or facial recognition system and they didn't have voice over it, that's the problem? I think identifying specific problems is hugely important, but then we can't leave it there. We have to solve those problems with alternatives.
Yeah. Well, on that forward-looking note, Divya, thanks so much for joining me. This is a lot of fun. There's so much stuff we explored. Actually, do you want to share, do you have like a personal website or somewhere people can go to read your writing on this stuff?
Yeah, I'm at divyasiddarth.in and also at Twitter at Divya Siddarth.
Okay, great. So I really recommend, especially if you're interested, people listening in the Taiwan piece, Divya did write this like really nice overview of how the Taiwanese system works. I found it really interesting. I think you will too, and I recommend as well checking out the white paper when it's out. The Don't Let's. I guess that's a working title, so maybe that's not what it'll be when it's out.
Yes, we're still working on it. The paper, as every paper I've ever written, is taking longer than planned, but we should be done in the next couple of weeks.
It's almost like you're a data scientist. I mean, yeah, it's not quite ready yet. Awesome. Well, while we wait for your model to compile, they can check out the Taiwanese piece. Thanks so much for joining me. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. This was great.